First of all, let me introduce our revered speaker. It is a tremendous pleasure to welcome Robert Saunders to the Leibniz Institute for Contemporary History. Robert Saunders is one of the most prolific, interesting, I think, and influential historians of his generation in the UK, and not only there, I dare to say. He's as present in the bookstore as on Twitter. For the last 10 years, he has been based at Queen Mary, University of London, where he teaches 19th and 20th century British history. In his PhD thesis at the University of Oxford, he engaged with the Second Reform Act of 1867, and he maintained his interest in the evolution and the trajectories of British democracy ever since. This interest also led him to contemporary history. In 2012, with Ben Jackson, he published a widely read and highly praised collected volume on the history of Thatcherism, which set the tone for the historical interpretation of the 1970s and the 80s, up to our day, perhaps the most contested period in British history at all. With Robert's expertise in the history of democracy and the history of the 1970s, he was perfectly suited to write a book that attracted a lot of interest when it came out. It could be, and actually was, called timely, and perhaps that's even an understatement. The history of the first referendum on the British membership of the European communities in 1975. When the book was published in 2018, British politics and the British public were still grappling with the outcome of the second referendum on this exact issue in 2016. And Robert's book enlightened the discussion enormously by bringing in historical expertise. Who could be more suited for a lecture on Brexit and democracy than Robert? We are truly delighted that you accepted our invitation and came to Munich. The lecture is part of an international autumn school for PhD students on the history of democracy in modern Europe, which the EFZ and the DAAD Research Hub for German Studies at the University of Cambridge jointly host, and which takes place at the EFZ this week. For me personally, it is highly encouraging, if I may say that we are able to discuss the contemporary history of democracy in Britain in a truly European setting. When Michael Kenny, a political scientist, was reviewing Robert's book on the 1975 referendum, he remarked in 2018, and I quote Michael Kenny, "As this impressive study demonstrates, the European question has a unique capacity to throw the familiar certainties and allegiances of British politics up into the air. Its appearance is especially timely, as it seems that we are once more waiting to see where the key pieces will fall." I'm not sure if we in the year 2023 already know where the key pieces actually have fallen. Historical expertise can surely help to better understand what actually has happened to the UK and to Europe in the last decades, and what role the much revered model of British democracy had played in all this. Robert, we are very much looking forward to your lecture. Thanks a lot for coming.
Thank you. Guten Abend. Mein Deutsch ist nicht so gut und wird immer schlechter, aber ich muss etwas auf Deutsch sprechen. Vorsicht, ein Engländer spricht Deutsch. Es ist mein erstes Mal in München, mein erstes Mal in Deutschland seit 24 Jahren. Also mein herzlicher Dank geht an Martine Steber für die Gelegenheit, diese schöne Stadt zu besuchen. Ich freue mich sehr, bei Ihnen zu sein. The danger is now over. That has exhausted my German. But I am very pleased to be here. I want to start this lecture on the 23rd of June 2016, which is, of course, the day that Britain voted to leave the European Union. That vote, by 52% to 48%, struck British politics like a volcanic eruption. Within hours of the vote, the Prime Minister had resigned, the Labour Party had declared war on its own leader, and the pound had fallen off a cliff. Brexit unleashed extraordinary emotions of vindication and loss. For some, it was a moment of national liberation, Britain's Independence Day. For others, it was more like an amputation or an act of self-harm. Brexit divided families, it ruptured friendships, it created new political identities, leavers and remainers, with the capacity to bulldoze existing party alignments. And over the following 3 years, it threatened to consume British politics. David Cameron was once asked what he most feared about the referendum. He replied, rather oddly, that it might unleash demons which ye know not. And it certainly did that. Now, why was Brexit so contentious? Well, it was so contentious because it spoke to all of the things that people care most about. It was about jobs, living standards, and the future of the economy. It was about patriotism, nationhood, and identity, memories of the past, and hopes for the future. It was about class, race, and immigration, the stability of the United Kingdom, and the security of Northern Ireland. It was also fundamentally about the most powerful idea in Western politics, democracy. For its supporters, Brexit offered a moment of democratic renewal, a chance to take back control of Britain's laws, its taxes, and its borders from an anti-democratic elite, both in Westminster and in Brussels. For David Cameron, on the other hand, it was a chance to rebuild democratic consent for membership, which he feared had worn dangerously thin. As we'll see, the referendum itself was part of a conscious project of democratic modernisation, an attempt to transfer decision-making power from elites in Westminster to the people whom they served. And on the morning of the result, Boris Johnson told the press, "The British people have spoken up for democracy in Britain and across Europe." And yet the challenge of delivering Brexit triggered a crisis in Britain's democratic institutions. Getting Brexit done would consume 3 prime ministers, 2 general elections, 2 historic court cases, and an attempt to suspend Parliament. It saw judges denounced as enemies of the people, MPs as saboteurs to be crushed. Ministers threatened to ignore acts of Parliament or revive the royal veto. MPs revived ancient parliamentary procedures to bind the hands of government. For its critics, Brexit had become a kind of bludgeon with which to smash democratic institutions and norms. For its supporters, Remainers were behaving like Donald Trump in 2020. They were refusing to accept the result of a democratic election that they had lost. Amidst claims of Russian interference or parliamentary obstruction, it became almost routine to say that democracy had been hijacked or that a coup d'etat was underway. All of this culminated in an unprecedented assault on Parliament, traditionally, of course, the seat of British democracy. In 2019, Boris Johnson attempted to suspend Parliament altogether. He accused it of thwarting the democratic decision of the British people. His most loyal newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, told its readers, "Parliament has forfeited its right to remain in existence." Now, the Supreme Court intervened and it restored Parliament, but the assault then intensified. The Conservative manifesto in 2019 attacked, and I quote, "a broken Parliament that simply refuses to deliver Brexit." When the Conservatives won that election, Johnson praised the new parliament as vastly more democratic than its predecessor. So ultimately, what had begun as an assault on the EU in the name of parliamentary sovereignty ended in an assault on Parliament in the name of popular sovereignty. So, why was Brexit so difficult for Britain's democratic institutions? And how did Parliament come to be seen as an anti-democratic force? I want to make three main propositions. First, Brexit was not just a crisis that happened in a democracy. Brexit was a crisis of democracy. It was about how democracies make decisions, who speaks for the people, what happens when different versions of democracy collide. Democracy is a very stable system of government, so long as we agree on the answers to those questions. If we don't, when that agreement breaks down, democracy becomes highly explosive because it stops being the way that we resolve our differences and it becomes the source and the object of division. So that's my first suggestion. Second, Brexit was a symptom, not just a cause, of Britain's democratic crisis. The argument for having a referendum in the first place was that Parliament was out of touch with the people, that if the European debate was to be settled democratically, it had to be taken out of the hands of Parliament and given to the country. And the result of the referendum, in which MPs overwhelmingly backed the losing side, seemed to vindicate that belief. So Brexit first exposed and then amplified a crisis of parliamentary democracy. That leads me to my final proposition, which is that Brexit was a contest between Democrats. And that was precisely what made it so dangerous. Everybody believed that they were speaking for democracy against the enemies of democracy. And there was no longer an agreed institution that could arbitrate between them. The result was a kind of democratic anarchy, or if we want to think about it in religious terms, a holy war. Brexit pitted different versions of democracy against each other, each convinced that they were the one true church and that others were the heretics. And that left very little room for compromise. So how did these things work out in practice? It's worth saying, of course, that none of these things were unique to Britain, but they did come together in a particular constellation around Brexit. So we might want to come back to the international dimensions of Brexit later. But for the moment, let's begin before the referendum on the road to 2016. For those who wanted to leave the EU, the argument had always been partly democratic. If we go back to Britain's first referendum in 1975, we find slogans like "the right to rule ourselves" plastered across campaign material. In 2016, again, the centerpiece of the Leave campaign was the demand to take back control, to wrest power from an elite in Brussels and return it to people who were democratically elected in Britain. Good example of this was Daniel Hannan's book, Why Vote Leave? Hannan was one of the intellectual architects of the Leave campaign. His book was a bestseller all the way through the referendum period. And Hannan put the democratic case front and centre. So his book includes chapters on things like why the EU can't be democratic and the sovereignty of the people. Naturally, he is now a member of the House of Lords. Likewise, when Boris Johnson came out for the Leave campaign, he said this: "It is this fundamental democratic problem, this erosion of democracy, that brings me into this fight." He called the loss of democratic control spiritually damaging. He accused the EU of trying to destroy democracy in Greece. Both Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings, who ran the Leave campaign, blamed the decline of democracy in the EU for the rise of the far right. And Cummings argued that by leaving the European Union, Britain could offer an example to the rest of Europe. of civilized, democratic, liberal self-government. Well, we're still working on that. Now, we don't have to take this rhetoric at face value. It's obviously more attractive to say, I am fighting for democracy, than to say, I am fighting to keep foreigners out, or I'm fighting to become leader of the Conservative Party. But that in itself demonstrates the power of the idea. To appeal to democracy is to invoke the highest principle of Western politics, one that most of us would regard as progressive and positive. Strikingly, the Remain campaign never really contested the democratic case. The democratic case for membership went entirely unheard. Remain chose instead to talk almost exclusively about economic risk. So it handed over the democratic argument exclusively to vote Leave. And a major poll on referendum day found that the number one reason given for voting Leave was democratic. You can see it in blue there, the principle that decisions about the UK should be taken in the UK. But how should they be taken? The obvious answer to that question was in Parliament. Eurosceptics got quite misty-eyed about Britain's 800-year parliamentary tradition. They talked about it as one of the things that set Britain apart from the continent. Boris Johnson said, "The most precious thing this country has given the world is the idea of parliamentary democracy." When Remainers claimed that Brexit would damage British exports, Boris Johnson rebukes them. He said, "The most valuable British export and the one for which we are most famous is the one that is now increasingly in question, parliamentary democracy." But that set up a paradox, because the Leave campaign also made a critique of British democracy, and that critique was central to the case for a referendum. For decades, Leavers and Eurosceptics had targeted their fire as much at Westminster as at Brussels. If we go back to our front pages here, you'll notice in the Daily Mail, it's talking about the people who rose up against an arrogant, out-of-touch political class. And they're talking here about Britain as much as Brussels. They accused MPs of lying to the public, channeling power to the EU, while denying that they were doing any such thing. The case for having a referendum was that Parliament could not be trusted with this question, that settling it democratically meant taking it out of the hands of Parliament and giving it to the people. And on that point, they were cresting something of a wave. Trust in Parliament had been falling for decades. Turnout at elections was at steep decline. In 2001, only 59% of voters came out to vote, 59%. If we include non-electors, the share of the vote won by the two main parties fell from more than 80% in the 1950s to barely 40% in 2010. But Britain's peculiar electoral system made it hard for new parties to break through. In 2015, UKIP, which was the main pro-Brexit party, won nearly 4 million votes. It got just one MP. So it's not surprising that UKIP looked outside Parliament for forms of democratic expression. We throw in a parliamentary expenses scandal in 2009, when MPs were found to have been claiming money for duck houses, horse stables, and adult sex toys. And it's perhaps not entirely surprising that trust in Parliament has fallen vertiginously. From 1984 to 2010, the percentage of people who said that they had confidence in Parliament fell from 41%, which is not a particularly high score to start with, to 24%. By 2019, levels of trust were roughly half the European average. So by about 2010, it was a cliche to say that British politics was broken, that the old politics needed to be ripped up and replaced. And nobody was saying that more loudly than the established parties. The Conservative manifesto in 2010 was called An Invitation to Join the Government of Britain. And it took as its central theme the idea of democratic renewal. It doesn't pull its punches. Millions of people in this country are detached from democracy, angry and disillusioned. We believe in people power, taking power away from the political elite and handing it to the man and the woman in the street. It talks about ensuring that power is passed from the politicians at Westminster to the people of Britain. Now, that argument applied to all sorts of areas of policy, but it became central to the case for a referendum. And we can see a kind of chain building here. So the first step was something called a referendum lock. Parliament would no longer be allowed to cede powers to the EU without holding a referendum first. So as the manifesto puts it, there would be no further extension of the EU's power over the UK without the British people's consent. Now, traditionally, Parliament was the place where the British people gave their consent. Now, Parliament is having to ask for that consent in a referendum. The referendum lock was introduced to Parliament by the Europe Minister, David Lidington. Now, Lidington is very much a moderate pro-European conservative. I think today he's the chair of the Königswinter Conference, which promotes Anglo-German friendship. And his speech is very interesting because it's an indictment of British democracy, not European. He told MPs there has been a profound disconnection between the will of the people and the decisions taken in their name. For too long, the people had been denied their say. A referendum would ensure that the people could make the big decisions. Now, that assumed, of course, that the people were not making decisions, were not having their say through Parliament. In fact, if we read these debates, Parliament barely appears at all. The referendum is presented as a direct link between government and the people. So this government is determined to reconnect with the British people, to decentralise power from government to the British people. This isn't a vision of democracy in which Parliament obviously features. You can see here the lineaments of an argument that would become much more prominent after 2016, that the will of the people had been ignored, that Parliament could not be trusted to represent them, that letting the people have their say was something that happened outside Parliament, not inside it. So in short, while the desire to leave the EU drew on a criticism of European democracy, the demands to have a referendum drew on a criticism of British parliamentary democracy. That was then followed in 2013 by the promise of an in-out referendum, and the same kinds of arguments were in play. The Conservative manifesto in 2015 told voters, for too long, your voice has been ignored on Europe. We believe in letting the people decide. So we will hold an in-out referendum on our membership of the EU. Now, clearly, this was a raising of the stakes, but it was also a different kind of referendum, and this wasn't widely commented on at the time. What the referendum lock had envisaged was a confirmatory referendum. So if Parliament decided to transfer powers, the public would be asked to confirm that decision. But in 2016, Parliament would make no decision at all. Remarkably, MPs never debated the question on which the referendum was fought. At no point did Parliament debate whether Britain should or should not leave the EU. So this wasn't a confirmatory vote, accepting or rejecting something that Parliament had done. This was an abdicatory referendum in which Parliament declared itself unfit to decide on the European question. And that would store up really significant problems after the result. So let's move on to that result. If the case for having a referendum was that Parliament was out of touch, the result turbocharged that claim. Out of 650 MPs, at least 486 had backed Remain. That's about 75%. It included the leaders of all the main parties. So MPs were now going to have to carry out a policy that most of them had campaigned against. Now, in theory, MPs could have ignored the result. There is no constitutional mechanism by which you can bind the hands of Parliament. So technically, this was an advisory referendum. In practice, this was never remotely likely. Both sides had promised to accept the result, and the consequences of not doing so would, I think, have been hair-raising. So very quickly, the major figures in British politics come out to endorse the result. So David Cameron told MPs, "It was not the result that I wanted, or the outcome that I believe is best for the country that I love. But what needs to happen is that we obey the will of the British people. We are a democracy, and that is what we will do." The Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, told journalists, "The British people have made their decision. We must respect that result, and Article 50, that's the trigger that begins the formal Brexit process, has to be invoked now." When Article 50 was invoked in 2017, it was backed by 500 MPs, nearly 80% of those who could vote. In England and Wales, which are the two countries that voted to leave, it was 86%. Now, that was partly for reasons of principle. MPs had voted to hold the referendum in the first place by more than 6-1, so most of them felt morally obliged to deliver the results. Most were not, in any case, particularly fervent about Remain. They'd backed Remain because they thought leaving would be disruptive or because they backed the party leadership, but it wasn't really a crusade. Most of them wanted it off the political agenda. But crucially, constituency pressure amplified the effects of the vote. In raw numbers, the referendum was very close. 52% Leave, 48% Remain. But the Remain vote was heavily concentrated in certain parts of the country: London, Scotland, and the major cities. The Leave vote was much more geographically dispersed. And because the UK doesn't have proportional representation, what that means is that the vast majority of MPs represented constituencies that had voted to leave. We don't have perfect figures, but it's likely that 410 out of 650 constituencies voted for Brexit. More than 3/4 of all Conservative MPs, nearly 2/3 of Labour MPs, sat for Leave-supporting seats. So talk of parliamentary democracy versus direct democracy was actually quite misleading. In many respects, Parliament became more Brexity than the wider electorate in the aftermath of the result. The only real challenge to that came from the Scottish National Party and Sinn Féin in Northern Ireland. But even here, the argument wasn't that the referendum should be ignored. It was that the results in their countries should be obeyed. These parties represented less than 10% of the House, so this doesn't have a particularly big effect. And among the UK-wide parties, there was general agreement that the result had to be delivered. Voters also seemed to agree. Polls quite quickly found that a majority of Remain voters thought that now the country had voted Leave, that result had to be enacted. That was certainly the view of the new Prime Minister, Theresa May, the dancing queen of British politics. Now, May herself had voted Remain, but she told her party in 2016, when it legislated to establish the referendum, Parliament put the decision to leave or remain in the hands of the people, and the people gave their answer with emphatic clarity. So now it is up to the government not to question, quibble, or backslide, but to get on with the job. Note it's the government, not Parliament, and that will be important. So if everybody's agreed, why is it so hard? Well, the answer, I think, is not that MPs were lying, or even that they changed their minds, though some did. Instead, it's about three structural problems that don't get enough attention. First, the referendum required government to do something very unusual. It had to carry a massive, highly complex, and hugely controversial policy through a hung parliament, a parliament in which it didn't have a majority. Technically, the Conservatives had a small majority in 2016, but they lost that altogether in 2017. Now, this scenario is almost completely unknown. In the British system, governments either have clear majorities, which means that they can do what they want, or if they don't have a majority, they trim their ambitions. They don't try to drive through policies for which they haven't got the numbers. But Brexit made that impossible. They had to try to do this. The solution might have been to work across party lines, but British politics doesn't really do that. It doesn't really have a tradition of that. The main party leaders in 2016, Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn, were both very tribal figures. There's a wonderful story in Michel Barnier's diaries. Michel Barnier was the EU's chief negotiator, and he was astonished to discover that Jeremy Corbyn didn't have Theresa May's phone number. And Jeremy Corbyn was equally astonished at the idea he would ever want to call her. So this was going to be a party fight at a time when no party had a majority. Now, that might not have mattered if it was just a case of saying yes or no to Brexit. Whenever that was the question, MPs said yes by large majorities. But the referendum had left some very big questions unanswered. And that brings us to our second problem. Voters in 2016 were asked a very specific question. Do you want to leave the EU? They were not asked on what terms Britain should leave. They were not asked when Article 50 should be triggered. They were not asked whether Britain should stay in the customs union or the single market, or whether it could leave without a deal at all. But these were crucially important questions. They would determine what Brexit actually meant in practice. They would determine the implications for immigration, for tariffs, for jobs, for Northern Ireland. These were questions on which leavers disagreed, as well as remainers. And it was those disagreements that would sink Theresa May's deal. Head into our third problem, which is that there was no longer any agreement on who should make those decisions. The conventional answer would, of course, be Parliament. Leavers had boasted of restoring sovereignty to Parliament. But if the test was what Parliament wanted, it wouldn't be doing Brexit at all. Conventionally, an MP's right to make decisions comes from the fact that they have won an election in their constituency. But in this instance, most MPs have been on the losing side. So right from the start, there was a sense that Parliament had a tempered sovereignty on this question, that votes in Parliament were only democratically legitimate if they were authorised by the referendum. And that set up some very chaotic thinking. This, for example, is from an article by Vernon Bogdanor, who is often described as Britain's leading constitutional expert. It appeared in the Daily Telegraph 2 days after the result. I'm going to be slightly rude about this article. So I should say that I think it's only fair to say that at this point in time, no one in British politics had slept for about 3 days. So no one was thinking particularly clearly. But this is what he wrote. The people have delivered an instruction which the government and Parliament will have to obey. Parliament will now be constrained, not by Brussels, but by the British people. The people have become a third chamber of the legislature, with the power to issue instructions which the politicians cannot ignore. The sovereignty of the people trumps the sovereignty of Parliament. Now, there are two big problems here. The first is, I think it misrepresents the problem. In the democratic age, parliamentary sovereignty is best understood as a form of popular sovereignty. Nobody pretends that Parliament has some source of power that is different to the people. The argument for Parliament is that this is how the people make decisions. If the people are going to make decisions outside Parliament, there needs to be some other mechanism by which they can do that. And that brings us to our second problem, which is that once we got past the question of leaving or remaining and moved on to the terms of Brexit, there was no such mechanism. The people were not sitting as a third chamber of the legislature. So Parliament was to be constrained by the people, but there was no agreed machinery for establishing what the people wanted. Now, there were, of course, some options. We could have held a referendum on the terms of Brexit. Dominic Cummings had suggested doing exactly that during the campaign. But that quickly came to be seen as anathema. It was seen as an attempt to rerun the referendum. Bogdanor himself called it an affront to democracy that would lack democratic legitimacy. Theresa May said it would be a gross betrayal of our democracy. Alternatively, we might have held a citizens' assembly, but that idea was not widely understood and it never really gained much traction. So these decisions would have to be taken in Parliament, but they would be tested against a will of the people for which there was no authoritative exponent. So the result was neither parliamentary democracy nor plebiscitary democracy, but what we might call prophetic democracy. Just as the Old Testament prophets claimed direct inspiration from God and used that to stand in judgment on kings and rulers, so politicians claimed direct inspiration from the people, and votes in Parliament would be judged against that standard. So let's take some examples. The task of delivering Brexit fell first to Theresa May, Prime Minister from July 2016 to July 2019. May consistently presented herself as a champion of the people, protecting their interests against game-playing MPs trying to frustrate the will of the people. Because of that, she fought tooth and nail to lock Parliament out of decision-making. She told supporters, "The negotiations are the responsibility of the government and nobody else." When campaigners argued that Parliament should decide when Article 50 was triggered, beginning a 2-year countdown to Brexit, she accused them of trying to subvert democracy. She fought a court case all the way to the Supreme Court to try to deny MPs a vote. She had to be compelled against her will to grant a vote on the Brexit deal. I think her view was captured in a very telling exchange with the Labour politician Ed Miliband. Miliband urged her not to shut Parliament out. He told her, "The government is a servant of this House, the House of Commons." May replied, to cheers from her backbenchers, "The government is a servant of the people, and we are delivering what the people want." May never doubted that her version of Brexit embodied the wishes of the people. She outlined her thinking in 4 major speeches. Significantly, none of them was delivered in Parliament. She told the party conference, "The people told us they want these things, and this government is going to deliver them." And when she published her deal in December 2018, she declared that it delivers for the British people. The result was a record-breaking parliamentary defeat. It was the biggest defeat ever suffered by a British government in parliamentary history. Her plans were rejected by 434 votes to 204, so a majority of 220 against. She put this deal to the House 3 times, and 3 times it was defeated. And strikingly, its strongest critics were not Remainers, but Brexiteers. So Boris Johnson, for example, complained that it kept Britain too close to the EU, that it would trap it in the customs union. But crucially, Johnson didn't just argue this was a bad deal, he argued that this was an undemocratic deal, that it was not what the people had voted for. He called it a democratic disaster, a wholly undemocratic deal, in defiance of the wishes of the people. He said, "No one voted for this type of Brexit, and no democratic politician could conceivably vote it. To pass it would be to cheat the 17.4 million people who had voted leave with contempt. It would be an attempt to cheat them of their victory." By contrast, the Labour Party wanted a closer relationship with the EU, but they too made the democratic argument. Jeremy Corbyn told MPs, "This is not the deal the country was promised, and Parliament cannot accept it. It is a bad deal for Britain and a bad deal for our democracy." Johnson and Corbyn wanted completely different things, but they were both confident that the people wanted those things too. Theresa May insisted that it was her opponents who were frustrating democracy. She made an extraordinary television broadcast in which she told viewers, "You, the public, have had enough. You are tired of the political games. I agree. I am on your side." She's recently published a book which I think will not be troubling the bestseller lists, in which he accuses MPs of, and I quote, an abuse of power for failing to pass her deal. So everybody here claimed to be acting democratically, while their opponents were the enemies of democracy. Now, that dynamic became even stronger when Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, to some remarkable front pages in the press. Johnson had been quite happy to use Parliament to block Theresa May's deal. He spoke and voted against her withdrawal agreement. And in that respect, if it was true that Parliament blocked Brexit, then Boris Johnson was as guilty as anybody else. But he never accepted its right to block his version of Brexit. Johnson probably had less support in Parliament than May did, but strategically he did have two key advantages. Firstly, unlike May, he had been part of the Leave campaign, and that strengthened his claim to ventriloquize the Leave vote. And secondly, he was willing to leave without a deal at all, conventionally regarded as the nuclear option. Crucially, that was the one form of Brexit didn't actually need parliamentary consent. Once Article 50 had been triggered, Britain was on a 2-year conveyor belt to exit. At the end of that time, the UK would leave the EU by automatic force of law, with or without a deal. So if Johnson did nothing at all, the UK would leave without a deal at the end of October. Now, in constitutional terms, there was no precedent for this situation, in which a huge change could happen automatically without Parliament ever voting for it. To stop that happening, Parliament also started doing some unprecedented things. As the deadline approached, backbenchers took control of the parliamentary timetable and they legislated to compel the Prime Minister to seek an extension. Johnson and his newspapers called this the Surrender Act. The government briefed the press that he might refuse to obey the law. But in many respects, this worked to his advantage. It made it possible to present Parliament as surrendering to the EU in defiance of the vote to leave, while Boris battled bravely for the people. Boris Johnson told MPs, "The people of this country can see what is going on. They know that Parliament does not want to honour the referendum." The Daily Express up here had welcomed the defeat of Theresa May's deal, but it now attacked MPs for blocking no deal as evidence of our so-called democracy. The attempt to suspend Parliament altogether flowed naturally from that logic. If, as Johnson believed, a no-deal Brexit was the will of the people, then Parliament had no right to resist it. In fact, as the Telegraph puts it here, it was his responsibility to give effect to the will of the nation. And note that that will is always singular. There is no sense here that the people might have different wills, which is the idea on which parliamentary democracy depends. This is democracy as an instruction issued by a united people. Now, that attempt was stopped by the Supreme Court, which issued its own declaration on how democracy ought to work. So Baroness Hale, in her famous spider brooch, declared, "We live in a representative democracy. The government is not directly elected by the people. The government exists because it has the confidence of the House of Commons. It has no democratic legitimacy other than that." That was not a view that Johnson and his supporters accepted. In their view, the government had the confidence of the people, while Parliament now lacked democratic legitimacy. So Geoffrey Cox, the Attorney General, which is the chief legal officer for the British government, declared, "This Parliament is a dead Parliament. It has no moral right to sit." The pro-Leave historian Robert Toombs, who had welcomed the defeat of Theresa May's deal, accused MPs of a parliamentary coup against a government trying to carry out a policy approved by the electorate. And down the bottom there, we have the Daily Telegraph pitching this as the judges versus the people. Now, that helps explain some positions that otherwise might look slightly hypocritical. For example, Bernard Jenkin was a Conservative MP and a senior member of the Leave campaign, and quite an interesting politician. Jenkin had voted 3 times in Parliament to reject Theresa May's deal. In that respect, he was as much to blame as anyone for Britain not leaving earlier. But when Parliament tried to block a no-deal Brexit, he accused it of refusing to implement popular decisions that it does not like. Direct democracy, he declared, trumps representative democracy. The difference in his mind was that Theresa May's deal did not meet the will of the people. So if Parliament had no right to block no deal, it had no right to pass May's deal. Who gave a mandate to this House, he asked, to set itself above the people? So this really wasn't about parliamentary democracy versus direct democracy, as Jenkin claimed. It was about parliamentary democracy versus prophetic democracy, and who had the right to interpret the instruction of the referendum. Now, all of this culminated eventually in a general election. Johnson presented himself in that election as the strong man who could smash the obstacles in the way of Brexit, including, as we've seen, a broken parliament that was obstructing the will of the people. That election produced an 80-seat majority for the Conservatives, which meant that his deal could now pass. As I said earlier, Johnson hails the new parliament as vastly more democratic than its predecessor. Now, the idea that one parliament is more democratic than another is in some ways distinctly odd, but it captured a very powerful idea that democratic legitimacy was not something that Parliament bestowed on the executive. It was a standard against which Parliament was to be held to account and against which it could be found wanting. The front page of the Daily Express on results day declared will of the people to finally be respected. On one level, the election resolved the immediate democratic crisis. The gap between Britain's parliamentary democracy and its prophetic democracy had now closed. But it has left a lasting effect on British democracy, especially in the idea that Parliament had betrayed the people. So after the election, the Brexit deal was rewritten to exclude Parliament from any further role in the next stage of the Brexit process. When a trade deal was agreed with the EU a year later, covering 1,200 pages of text, Parliament was summoned for one afternoon to pass it through all its stages. There's been a surge in the use of what are called Henry VIII clauses, or skeleton bills. These are forms of legislation in which Parliament essentially hands over its lawmaking powers to ministers. That was then amplified during COVID for fairly obvious reasons, but there's been no let-up since. If you've been following British politics in the last 2 weeks, you'll know that Rishi Sunak has announced a series of major policy changes on net zero, on high-speed rail, on the banning of smoking, on reform of the education system. Parliament was not consulted on any of those changes, and some of them will be irreversible by the time they reach the House. When he was asked on the BBC where his mandate came from, Rishi Sunak replied that he instinctively understood what the British people wanted. He said, "I have a good sense of what the British people's priorities are." So prophetic democracy, it appears, is alive and well. So in another sense, the democratic crisis continues. The word crisis comes from the word for a crossing. A crisis is a fork in the road, when different paths open up for the future. Brexit exposed some fundamental choices about democracy. How do we make decisions? Who speaks for the people? Is democracy an argument or an instruction? Ultimately, Brexit carried Britain down one path, but democracy is always a word in motion, constantly forged and reforged by new understandings of the people. We can make different choices in the future, but that will require British politics to do some very serious thinking about the most basic questions of a democratic society. If democracy is a system in which the people rule, Who are the people? And how do they govern? Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much indeed for an absolutely brilliant lecture, and as entertaining it was as worrying it is actually to have demonstrated or to get demonstrated all these kind of conceptions of democracy, the people, the role of institutions and processes in democracy in a way which we could discuss whether as historians we still can describe them as democratic. You know, and this is done in the name of democracy. So there's enough on the plate for a controversial discussion, and I invite you to ask your questions. Yes, we've got a first one. You need to use the microphone, and I'm happy to invite people at the Zoom in the Zoom webinar to ask their questions via the chat function, and I will read them out and put them to Robert. Now.
Great. Thanks so much for that lecture, Rob. I enjoyed it immensely. The 2016 referendum triggered a series of really quite extraordinary democratic events. But one of those events which you didn't really touch on that much in the lecture was the election that took place in the summer of 2017. Theresa May lost her very narrow majority. That was against all expectations, really, not least her own. And I was sort of wondering how you're going to how you sort of fit that into this curious story, because on the one hand, this should have been an election that was all about Brexit, in which the sort of democratic energies of the referendum were channeled back into the sort of traditional democratic forms that Britain was accustomed to, namely the election. And yet the result it produced seemed to actually create new, peculiar democratic energies as a result of the result that it produced. So I'm just sort of curious as to whether this was a sort of peculiarity within this story, or whether the strange result of the 2017 election actually plays into the story of chaos that the referendum produced in British politics.
Thank you. I do think the 2017 election is a really curious moment in this story, and you're absolutely right to bring it up. It happened because Theresa May inherited a majority of, I think, about 10 seats, and she recognised that was not going to be enough to get this very complex and controversial issue through. And at a time when she was riding high in the polls, there was an opportunity here to win a big majority that would liberate her from parliamentary factions. But the extraordinary feature of that election is that it ended up not really being about Brexit, because both main parties said, we will honour the result of the referendum. What they didn't do was engage in any detail in how they would honour it. And this drew on another problematic dynamic of the referendum itself, which was the tendency to deny that there were any difficult questions in play, to deny that there was a problem around the Northern Ireland border, or that there were trade-offs, that you had to choose between the degree of sovereignty you would regain to strike trade deals abroad or to change your own domestic legislation, and the degree of access that you would have to the European market. There was very little willingness politically to engage in those questions, other than to say that this was Project Fear or this was troublemaking by Remainers. So Labour went into the campaign promising a Brexit for jobs, while Theresa May went into the campaign promising a red, white and blue Brexit. And frankly, it didn't get much better than that, which meant that actually the election became about other things. It became about domestic policy. It became about Theresa May's manifest shortcomings as a campaigner, and Jeremy Corbyn's surprising skill as a campaigner. But we got to the other side of it without having clarified any of the big questions that we could have used that election to do. So it's an extraordinary missed opportunity.
take one question from our Zoom audience, and this is Joyce Bennett, our colleague from the Holocaust Center. How do you see the role of the two other high-stakes referenda that Cameron engaged in, the electoral reform and the Scotland referenda in the run-up of the EU referendum?
Yes. So I think those two referendums are both influential in different ways. So Britain had a referendum in 2011 on whether it should change its electoral system. It was rather a damp squib. The alternative put forward was one that no one particularly wanted, even among electoral reformers. So it wasn't kind of a big public debate, but the campaign to keep the existing electoral system was run by Dominic Cummings, who would later run the Brexit campaign. And you can see him trialing a lot of the same techniques that would be used in the campaign. So it's kind of a learning experience. The Scottish election, I think, cast a bigger shadow in that it wildly misled David Cameron on how to win a referendum. The lesson that they drew from the Scottish referendum was you can pitch a romantic, emotional appeal to self-government against a warning that your economy will suffer. And the economic argument will win. That if you put those two things against each other, romantic desire for independence, you're going to get poorer, the economy will win. And they're very clear in all of the kind of memoirs and diaries that the Remain campaign have put out. That's the model that they were fighting. Which is very odd, because if you look at the Scottish referendum, you begin the campaign with a huge vote for staying in the Union, and you end with a tiny, the Union barely survives that referendum. So the Unionists had lost the campaign there very badly. And during the Brexit referendum campaign, you can see the kind of collapse of a whole model of how you do politics, in that they start from the assumption you fight on the economy and you win. So they keep putting out economic experts on the airwaves. And every time they do it, the Leave vote goes up. So they put more economic experts on the airwaves, more businessmen, and Leave vote keeps going up. And at one point, David Cameron says in his memoirs, it felt like the physics of politics were changing. We didn't understand how to do politics anymore. And it culminates in his communications director, when the result comes out, simply doubling up and being sick in the street. That an understanding of how to win elections had collapsed, but it was, I think, a mistaken understanding of how to win elections.
Mm-hmm. Now, Kiran Patel.
Thank you very much for this lecture. It was great listening to you. I also had a question on referendums, but this has already been asked. If I may, I'll have two other questions. Firstly, you showed many pictures from the press at the time, and I would just like to hear you talk a little bit about the dynamics and the role of the press in this, because, well, the question is how important was particularly tabloid press, also in comparison to social media, to other factors that, of course, don't make for such nice PowerPoint presentations. But I still wonder, if you will, how much the traditional sphere of the press, that has been very powerful also in shaping the discourse, I would imagine, has also been leading to this slippery slope of, well, reassessing the very nature of democracy. And the second question, if I may, also touches upon referendum to some extent. I'm a great fan of your book on the 75 referendum. Now, this came out in 2018. I just wonder, and I'd like to ask you, now knowing what has happened since 2018, since the 16 referendum, do you think there's anything you'd like to change in your book on the 75 referendum? With the benefit of hindsight, if you will.
Thank you. Two great questions. Firstly, on the press, I think the press, the kind of newspapers I'm talking about in particular, really lend themselves to a talk about prophetic democracy, because in some ways they're very drawn to that model of democracy. The idea, the Sun says, or the Daily Mail speaks for the people of Britain, is very much part of the tabloid model. So I think they're quite naturally drawn to that understanding of democracy. In terms of what their role was during the referendum, I think it's fair to say that it's tempting to exaggerate the role of the press. Newspaper readership in Britain has been collapsing for decades. And it was clear in the 2017 referendum actually how little capacity papers like The Sun and the Mail had to halt Labour's resurgence. But where they are hugely important is within the Conservative Party. So certainly from the moment that the polls closed in 2017, and it was clear that Theresa May had lost her majority, one of the most important questions of British politics is, when is the next leadership election coming? It's clear that she's a dead woman walking, as the term goes. There's going to be a leadership contest, and that will be fought among Conservative Party members. And Conservative Party members read these papers wildly disproportionately. I think something like a third of Conservative Party members reads the Telegraph. It might be a fifth the Daily Mail. So for the internal politics of the Conservative Party, which is where the real battle for Brexit was fought, these papers were constantly pored over and scrutinised, and I think really did have a powerful conditioning role. On the book, I mean, I'm sure there are all sorts of things I'd change, but not necessarily because of the way that Brexit turned out. And that's partly because I really didn't want that to be a Brexit book. So, as everyone knows, academic books take forever to write. I started writing that book in 2012. It was meant to come out before the referendum, and it was mostly written before the referendum. And then, administrative hell descended, and it was delayed. And I think, actually, when I look back at it, I hope I did a reasonably good job of controlling my political preferences on Brexit, because I was conscious that that was an issue. I think I was actually much less successful at controlling my preferences on the internal politics of the Labour Party. And I think sometimes if you read the sections on Tony Benn in that book, it's fairly clear that I'm thinking about Jeremy Corbyn. And so if I were to try and sort of correct for the state of mind I was in at the time, it would be more actually about how I wrote about the politics of the Labour left than about the EU debate.
I've another two questions from the chat by Matthew Stipper. The first is, was the real crisis for British democracy the murder of Jo Cox MP, in the sense that it has discouraged many people from entering political life, fearing for their own and their families' safety? And the second one is a question informed by German history. And Matthew Stibbe reminds us of the impact of referenda in Weimar Germany, where there are two versions of referendum present. One is the type of referendum you called abdicatory referendum, and the other one is a referendum by popular initiative. Now, Matthew argues that the Basic Law of 1949 banned both types of referenda, and he was now asking, was it right to do so?
Thank you. On the murder of Jo Cox, so for anyone who doesn't know, Jo Cox was a much-loved Labour MP who was stabbed, I think, 2 days before the vote. I want to be careful about what the murder itself said about Brexit, because it's fairly clear we were talking about a particularly disturbed individual. I think we have to be a little bit careful what wider political lessons we draw from that. What I did think was horrendous was the response of the government to that. That this was a moment, I mean, particularly in 2019, British politics reached a kind of sulphurous mood that it hasn't seen since the summer of 1914, when there really were very well-founded fears of violence against MPs. And that was consciously cranked up by Dominic Cummings in order to increase the pressure on MPs to try to make them crack. And he's been fairly explicit about that, I think. Not of course that he wanted to promote violence, but he wanted MPs to feel the pressure, and he wanted to keep boiling the kettle, as it were, underneath politics. And when a Labour MP appealed to Boris Johnson in the House to dial down the rhetoric because MPs were frightened, Johnson said something like, "I've never heard such humbug in all of my life. The best way to resolve that problem is to pass Brexit, is to get this done." So there was a willingness to weaponize the climate of fear of British politics. And I do think that was very destructive. On the question about whether it's right to ban referendums, I mean, I don't think referendums have to be destructive to democracy. I think there are plenty of countries where referendums are used reasonably successfully, and I think they can be used with the grain of parliamentary democracy. But you do have to think very carefully about how you use them. And there was no serious debate about how you use a referendum in Britain in the 2010s, in the way that there was in the 1970s. There was no discussion of what would happen if the vote was to leave and how that situation would be managed. And, you know, I ended up, to give my own position on this, I never thought that there should be I never thought it was worth rerunning the referendum. I never thought that was a good idea. But I did come to the conclusion in 2019 that there should be a confirmatory vote. That if Parliament couldn't agree on which version of Brexit it wanted, rather than just, you know, whoever could kind of outlast anybody else, we should say, which version do you want, and put that to a new referendum. So I think referendums work reasonably well when they come at the end of the legislative process. I think they're really problematic when they come at the start. And that was our mistake.
I would like to take questions now in pairs. And on my list is first Helena Schwinghammer and then Isabel Heinemann.
Yeah, thank you for this very interesting talk. I was concerned about the thing or your point that Brexit is a symptom of democracy crisis. And I was really remembered when I read all the quotes you have on your slides of Hubert Aiwanger, who said, holen wir uns unsere Demokratie zurück, like bring back our democracy. And he's the vice prime minister in Bavaria, like the largest federal state in Germany. And he said something like that just a few months ago. And I wondered how specific Britain this crisis of democracy was, or how it fits in the greater crisis of democracy in Europe or in Western states.
Isabel?
Yes, I can just jump in here. So thanks for the talk, first of all. And in our conference now, we have been talking quite a bit about the importance of functioning parliaments in terms of functioning democracies. And from German history, of course, we know about the importance of parliaments, and we know what happens when parliaments are dismissed and dismantled. And you told us a history of the dismantlement, dismemberment, sidelining of the parliament, culminating in this quote by Sunak: "I sense what the people want," completely neglecting what the parliament might say, or this Tory MP saying the government has to be the servant of the parliament. And my question would be, how can you see that the parliament can sort of be, I don't know, protected, its authority reinstated? I sense it could be the Supreme Court having an impact here, but in the quote you presented us, it looked as if even this was sort of ignored. So where's the possibility of the parliament being put to work effectively or be protected in its ability to work? Thank you.
Thank you. I think they're both very related questions, actually. So I'll try and to answer them together. I think it's not unusual for democracies to become frustrated with parliaments, because parliaments are intensely annoying institutions. You know, parliaments are places where you bring together people who disagree, who then argue. Absolutely. I'm very much, you know, my fundamental political principle, I think, is probably parliamentary democracy. But there is a reason why democracies fall out of love with them. They slow things down. They take forever. Oppositions do use procedural games. They institutionalize opposition. They make it hard to get things done. And so you could chart plenty of previous points in British history before, where, you know, anti-parliamentary sentiment has become powerful, particularly between about 1912 and 1914. So the temptation to sweep them away and to say, you know, we haven't got time for this anymore, that the will of the people can be expressed more directly, is always very powerful. Because of that, I think it's doubly important to make the case for parliaments. And I think in British politics, at any rate, no one has actually made a serious case for parliamentary democracy for a very long time. There was a kind of learning experience about the importance of parliaments in the mid-20th century, which had an enduring cultural power for maybe 30, 40 years afterwards. But that memory has now fallen away. And I think it is about making the argument for why this isn't an obstacle to democracy. This is a version of democracy that we really believe in, precisely because it aspires to represent all of the people in their full diversity. It says that democracy is an argument or a discussion between people of different opinions. I've always really liked the fact that the leader of the opposition in Britain, technically the title is the leader of His Majesty's loyal opposition. The idea that opposition is actually a service to democracy and not something that stands outside democracy and tries to frustrate it. So I think it's really about a kind of long process of argument and discussion and education, because at the moment, I don't think that argument is well understood, even among MPs and political journalists. There's a line in the memoirs of Gavin Barwell, who was Theresa May's chief of staff, and I think is very much one of the good guys of British conservative politics and a very thoughtful and interesting character. And he says, it was very clear to me after the election in 2017 that we were going to have to govern in coalition with Parliament, and we're not really used to that. We don't understand Parliament. So I'm going to have to try and find out about Parliament, because British governments are used to dominating Parliament. So they don't have to think about why it's there, why opposition might be a good thing, why scrutinising legislation might be positive. There's a long argument to be made again in the wake of Brexit as to why we should value that.
For Helena Schwinghammer's question, perhaps we can take up this as well. So is this a crisis of British democracy or a British communicative crisis between democratic institutions, or is it a crisis of Western democracy and liberal democracy in the West?
I think one of the challenges of writing about Brexit is that there are two quite important ideas which pull in opposite directions. One is that Brexit is deeply rooted in British history, and that you can't understand Brexit without thinking about things like the memory of the Second World War, or the legacies of empire, or the nature of parliamentary democracy. And then there's another argument that says Brexit is simply a British manifestation of a populist movement across the world, and that it belongs in a family of phenomena in which we might include the election of Donald Trump, Modi in India, Orban in Hungary, and so on. And those things, they're not incompatible, but they slightly pull apart. And I think the way I'd want to think about it is that there are clearly challenges to democracy that are global, and they're partly to do with new social media. They're partly to do with generational change. They're partly to do with the effects of globalization and deindustrialization. And these are kind of common challenges that lots of late Western democracies are facing. But those challenges operate on a particular local environment, and so they take peculiar form in each place. So I would accept that Brexit has certain common dynamics with, say, the AfD phenomenon or Trump, but it is not the same as those things. And I think it's really important not to just bundle all of these things together into a kind of single populist wave, which I think is sometimes what happens in liberal commentary.
So my next pair is Helena Trenchik and Anna Friedrich.
Thank you. Thanks for the talk. It got me really psyched. So, I mean, you don't know how much of my brain space goes on something I wasn't even old enough to vote in. But maybe a bit of a messy question, but I wanted to ask about the thing that you ended on, this kind of unnerving thought that Sunak is also announcing new changes, and this, I just got the sense, I had a feeling, I consulted a We Are board and the British people told me that's what they wanted. And that so prophetic democracy continues. And I find this really worrying, because this traditional kind of view of Parliament, which, I was taught that you have parties which put forward a manifesto, they're elected on the basis of it, they try and get it through, just seems completely idealistic to the point of absurdity now, perhaps because the will of the people seems more fast changing and they are presenting themselves as needing to respond. I don't know, maybe in the way Chris Clark's Time and Power says that Bismarck essentially does this. He says, like, everything's sped up, so I, the supreme leader, must simply interpret things. I don't have time. But for me, I was thinking about Labour as well in this kind of era of, I see eras of absurdity, because at the moment, I mean, I listen to all these political podcasts and they talk about, well, Keir Starmer is now going to do this because he needs to win. And when he does win, well, we don't know what he actually will do. It'll be better than Tories, but we have basically no idea. And I think that this feels really, really bad. It kind of mimics, you have to put forward a vision afterwards, where once you've interpreted people, and to say this open absurdity that, yeah, you can vote and your vote will be interpreted is very worrying. And it reminds me of what Runciman writes on Orwell's Hypocrisy, about how hypocrisy is bad, but the worst bit is when hypocrisy is impossible, when people are openly lying and you cannot get away from that fact. So overall, to me, I find this very worrying, this prophetic democracy, and I wanted to ask your opinion on where it's going next and the Labour Party in the next election.
Thank you.
Sorry for the long question.
No.
Fine. Anna Friedrich.
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. I also liked it very much. And nevertheless, I'm still struggling with the question of how we could bridge the gap between the people, or let us say the people who voted for Brexit, and us in the room who would all agree that there are different notions of democracy, that Parliament is an important form of democracy, and so on.
Thank you. I'm very glad you were psyched, Helena. A German friend of mine said to me once, your lectures are always utterly depressing, but I come away feeling strangely invigorated. So I wasn't quite sure what to do with that. But so on Labour, I mean, one thing I didn't have time to talk about, but I think is part of this phenomenon, is the Corbyn phenomenon in 2016. That after the results, Labour MPs decide, there was a kind of eruption of fury against Jeremy Corbyn, who was seen as not having campaigned particularly energetically for Remain. And Labour MPs passed a vote of no confidence in him, which was then overruled by the Labour Party membership. And he was restored to the leadership by Labour Party members in what was, again, an explicitly anti-parliamentary campaign. The argument was this is an elite in Westminster who have no business telling the Labour movement who their leader should be. And that there was lots of talk of the mandate, and the leader who has a mandate from the party, which MPs interfere with at their peril. And, without getting into the question of what we think of Jeremy Corbyn, it was a very similar constitutional argument to the argument that was being made around Brexit. MPs are an elite and they need to be contained by some force outside them. And that became hugely important in 2019, because the most basic principle of a parliamentary constitution is that the government must command the confidence of the House of Commons. Now, it was manifest that Boris Johnson did not command the confidence of the House of Commons. The House of Commons was legislating to bind his hands and instruct him to do things. So they should have removed him constitutionally. But they couldn't, because they had even less confidence in Jeremy Corbyn as the alternative. But they couldn't remove either Jeremy Corbyn or Boris Johnson from the leadership of their parties because they had given that right to the membership. So we had a complete constitutional lockdown. And this is another element in which parliamentary democracy is not well understood. Both parties have created these systems in the name of democracy, in which they hand over the right to appoint their leader to their members, but nobody thought about what that was going to mean for the working of parliamentary democracy. And we're still wrestling with that problem. And that perhaps leads into Anna Friedrich's question about, what do we do? Or how do we bridge the gap? I think one thing that's really important to say, I'm not trying to suggest that there was a sort of golden age of parliamentary democracy before 2016. I think the critique of Parliament takes root for a very good reason, which is that we have an appalling electoral system, which means that very large numbers of people genuinely do feel unrepresented. I am very much a Remainer, but I think it is democratically outrageous that 4 million people voted for UKIP in 2015, and they got one MP, and they only got him because he was a Tory defector. So this was a parliamentary system that locked out very large sections of the country. We can't be surprised if people look at Parliament and don't see a democratic institution when you have that kind of problem. Parliament is much too much under the control of the executive. It can't control its own timetable. It has very little say over what it debates or when it debates. Party discipline is much too tight. Those of us who want a parliamentary system also have to actually argue for a revamp of the parliamentary system. We have to be willing to say our parliamentary system is sick and does need repair, but not by handing power to these Old Testament prophets, but by actually thinking about what would we do if we wanted Parliament to live up to its reputation, if we wanted it actually to be representative of the people.
Next two people on my list, are myself and Oliver. Now I'm struck actually by the way the concept of democracy was used in political struggle. And from a history of concept point of view, one could, I think, argue with good reason that democracy didn't have any content any longer. In German kind of conceptual history theory, there's the idea of the plastic wort. So it's a plastic concept, which is free of any content, free of any meaning, but is simply a weapon in political struggle. And if that is the case, then British democracy has lost its vision of democracy. And then the question would be, why was that the case, and what were the reasons for this, and when did it start? And and I think this is a very interesting question to be put to contemporary history. So one could perhaps argue that after the breakdown of the Cold War framework, where British democracy had its particular vision of deriving from the UK stance during the Second World War as kind of the torch of liberty in Europe, the torch of democracy in Europe, and so on and so on. We all know these narratives, and they are in a way not suddenly lost, but they are undermined after whatever a decade or so. A second guess would be neoliberalism, and the way neoliberal logics changed visions of democracy and sort of reinvented democracy as kind of oriented at ideas of the market, but B, also changed the way the British state and the democratic state worked and was visible to citizens in the country. And the third kind of guess would be the question of how British democracy and the British Constitution deals with regionalism. So that's the Scottish question, the Welsh question, the Irish question, but also very much so the English question. And so it's kind of a culmination of different ways in which British democracy was dismantled in a way. I'm not sure if I'm right, but that's my question basically, whether we could think in this context. And now Oliver.
Thank you very much, Robert, for a fascinating presentation. I must say, seeing some of those newspaper front pages after all these years really quite viscerally kind of brought me back to those quite confusing days. I wanted to press you perhaps on your answer to Isabel Heinemann's earlier question. I also agree that we need to make a stronger case for parliaments and for parliamentary democracy. But what might this process of parliamentary re-enchantment actually look like in practice from your perspective?
Sorry, do you mean what would the educative process look like?
Or how would we make the case for Parliament in this incredibly sort of multipolar and complex context, taking into account widespread sort of disillusionment and so on with respect to parliaments?
Right, huge range of things to think about there. So to start perhaps with Martina's questions, I actually don't think that democracy has been stripped of meaning. I agree that it's plastic, but I don't think it's infinitely so. I think democracy is at core a principle that the people should govern. And as I said, it doesn't tell us who the people are or how they should govern. And that opens up all sorts of alternative versions of democracy. But those core principles actually do matter, and they do lock out certain other forms of politics. Everyone in the Brexit debate did agree that the people should decide on Brexit. They might have called for a people's vote, or they might have talked about the will of the people, or they might have wanted Parliament to do it, or Nicola Sturgeon might have wanted Scotland to have its own course on this. But they all actually agreed on a fundamental principle that this was a question that should be in the jurisdiction of the people, which isn't a claim that would have been accepted by most British parties 200 years ago. So I think it's not infinitely malleable. And I do think we should accept that these are alternative versions of democracy. I think it's unhelpful to always frame the argument as they are enemies of democracy, they are anti-democracy, which my camp is as guilty of as anybody else is. I think we should be more willing to say there are forms of democracy that are malign. That democracy is not always a good, that there are forms of democracy that are authoritarian and anti-pluralist and fundamentally exclusionary, which we should argue against. I mean, I was saying to my students the other day that if you had told the Victorians that Donald Trump would become president of the world's flagship democracy, they wouldn't have been in the least surprised. That's what they thought democracy was. And liberal and parliamentary forms of democracy evolve subsequently, but they are only one manifestation. They're one that's worth defending. But I think we have to recognize that the reason that these populist claims appeal is partly because people look at them and they recognize them as democratic. And that perhaps gets to the next part of your question about sort of what's changed and why people are attracted to this. As someone who isn't instinctively drawn to referendums and didn't like the results, there was something remarkable about the fact that 60 years of government policy could be overturned by a democratic vote. That was in some way a remarkable democratic fact. There was something extraordinary about a referendum in which every vote counted the same, which wasn't just fought in a small number of swing constituencies, but in fact, every voter that you mobilized in every part of the country had democratic agency, in which you weren't bound simply to accept whichever candidate had been put forward by a party machine in your local area. There were things that were genuinely invigorating about that referendum. Likewise, the fact that part of the appeal of Brexit was a kind of reaction against neoliberalism. It was about saying we've had a period in which we're told that these questions are outside the realm of democratic politics, that questions about industry and economic strategy are just matters of globalization now. They're not matters for democratic decision-making. Brexit was partly saying they are. It was partly a reaction against a model of representation in which most MPs are middle-class graduates. So, I think we should be willing to look at the Brexit vote and see things that are democratically admirable. And part of, if you want to restore Parliament, as I do, part of that is learning from that, actually, and thinking about, actually, what could a parliamentary system try to draw from that might be positive. And I guess that speaks a little bit to Ollie's point that I don't have a great answer for how do we make the case, other than that I fundamentally believe in the power of argument and debate. And I think if you don't believe in that, it's not clear why you'll be a Democrat at all. But we do have some tools. If we take an issue like, I hold what used to be an extraordinarily eccentric opinion, which is that party members should not choose party leaders, that party leaders in the parliamentary system should be elected by MPs. That is still a minority opinion, but it's not any longer quite such a mad opinion as it was when I was first voicing it in 2016. So I think, we have the amazing access to people through social media and through all sorts of other forms of communication. We need to use it. respectfully to make democratic arguments.
Now, this is the call for the last round of questions. I've got Samantha on my list. Is there anyone else? Yeah, please.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I have to reiterate what Ollie said, that this was a great walk through memory lane. I remember exactly where I was when the result of Brexit was announced, and it feels like no time has passed yet, so much time at all. So I also have to apologise, because my question is actually about something that hasn't actually yet been implemented in relation to Brexit, and that's the new visa waiver system called ETIAS. Not sure exactly what it stands for, but do you understand? And actually, this was something that was brought to mind when standing in passport control when arriving in Munich on Monday, standing in the huge queues and thinking, goodness, what is this going to be looking like when this is finally implemented? But I think my question is that actually this system was supposed to be introduced back in 2021, and it's keep on being delayed, keep on saying, well, it's going to be 2022, 2023, and I think at the moment their current estimation is May 2024. And also the other surprise for me is that I've just searched the word ETIAS on the BBC News app, and there are about 4 articles that come up, and the most recent one is on the 4th of April 2019. Essentially, it's not being talked about, and I know, like, I've mentioned this to some of my friends, and they say to me, like, what on earth are you talking about? So I guess I wonder to what extent this lack of discussion, like on, Britain's arguably main news channel, and the delay, the continuous delay to it, I'm not even convinced it will happen in May 2024. To what extent this is to do with the challenge in trying to find the balance between legally enforcing Brexit and the democratic vote attached to it, trying to honour the fact that the British citizens want to leave the EU, and the damage to the economic benefits that many European countries actually do receive from British tourists. I mean, if we think about how many countries have tourist economies that are bolstered by British tourists, and I'm thinking of the Greek islands and southern Italy, for example, and Spanish islands like the Canary Islands. To what extent there is this concern that there would potentially be like a reciprocal damage if this visa waiver system was introduced in the wrong way. And as I said, I know that this hasn't been introduced, and I guess this is quite hypothetical, but this has been on my mind for a while. And I guess there is this democratic element to it where you have to try and appease the vote at the same time as not trying to block movement and create this economic and also, I guess, social damage.
My question is a bit of a change of topic. Going back to your prophetic democratic concept, I was wondering who is the people in that concept and how it varies according to parties, and whether it is also dynamic in terms of, does it mean party membership? Is it really representative of a unifying will of the people that is somehow identifiable? Yeah, really just who's the people in these various concepts?
Thank you. So like Sam, I can remember where I was when Brexit, when I heard the news, partly because I was supposed to be doing a press conference actually on the morning of the results, and I got a text in the night. Some of you may remember that in London, it rained like it was the apocalypse on referendum day. And it rained so hard that the roof collapsed of the building we were supposed to be in, which felt like something of a metaphor for what was happening to British politics. But I mean, the point you've made about visas, we could kind of replicate across the whole spectrum of public policy. There are all sorts of areas in which the British state simply doesn't have the capacity actually to do the things that are necessary in order to conform with the Brexit deal that it signs. And so all sorts of other kind of import checks and sanitary checks are constantly being pushed back and pushed back and pushed back. And that's partly because of, if you like, kind of the original sin of the Brexit debate, which was that you couldn't really plan for those things, because planning for those things meant admitting that they were real, that Brexit was going to mean that travel would get harder, that there would be barriers to trade, that some things would become more difficult. And there was an extraordinary reluctance to accept that. I think there is a perfectly honourable case to be made that Britain should leave the EU, that there will be these trade-offs involved, but that the benefits outweigh the costs. But that never was the argument that was made. It was always this will be cost-free, and that costs are either sort of fantasies of Remainers or they're punishment beatings issued by the EU, for which we simply have to show resolution. And the problem there is that, firstly, it pumps conspiratorianism into British politics, because you have to explain why these things are happening. And they must be happening not because of Brexit itself, but because of saboteurs, or Remainers, or the Surrender Acts, or bad actors in the EU. You have to constantly be finding villains who have wrecked this vision. But secondly, what you end up with is massive democratic disillusion. You know, that 3 million people voted in 2016, it's estimated, who hadn't voted for decades, that this really was an important democratic promise. If those people come to conclude that Brexit has failed them, then that has really serious consequences for faith in democracy and for trust in democratic politics. And I think that, in a way, might be the most lasting damage of the story that I've been telling. And then, you know, just finally, the point about who is the people, I think it's the core question of democracy. On the morning of the results, Nigel Farage gave a brief press conference in which he said, this is a victory for real people. And it was a very telling phrase, you know, that the elites were defeated, the real people won. And I think broadly, you can say there are kind of two models of the people which democracies deploy. One, as I've suggested, is a pluralist model of the people, in which we belong to different classes, go to different churches, live in different parts of the country, do different kinds of jobs, read different newspapers, and we bring all of those different experiences to democracy, which tries to arbitrate within that sort of glorious cacophony of voices. And then there's an alternative in which there are the people and the enemies of the people. And those enemies of the people are elites. And that model, that second model, is clearly in the ascendancy across much of Western politics, but I think it's extremely dangerous.
Thank you very much indeed. How did your friend tell you your lectures are deeply depressing but highly inspiring? And I think that's a very good characterization of this evening. I actually feel inspired and I've got a lot to think about, so thank you very much indeed. And we are going to continue our discussions on democracy, and we are going to continue our research on the history of democracy, because I think this is one answer to the crisis of democracy we are facing, not only in Britain, but in other European and Western industrial countries as well. So thanks a lot again. And there are drinks and there's some food outside. Unfortunately, we can't beam this to the Zoom webinar. So thanks a lot to everyone for coming, for listening, for discussing the hypotheses and the arguments, and hopefully soon again here at the EFZ. Thanks a lot to people in the Zoom, and well, let's get some wine and beer and water and whatever.